What if I told you there's a place in America where the government paid every single resident to leave forever and never return? Not because of war, not because of natural disaster, but because the very ground beneath their feet had become so poisonous that staying meant death. Times Beach, Missouri exists today as a monument to environmental catastrophe, where in 2025, cleanup costs have reached $2.1 billion, a sum larger than the entire GDP of nations like Malta or Iceland. Families who thought they were buying the American dream found themselves paying with their health and homes. But this disaster didn't happen overnight. It began with what seemed like the deal of the century. The $2 billion promise that started everything. In 1925, the St. Louis Star-Times newspaper executives launched what they believed was marketing genius. Their offer was simple: buy a 6-month subscription for $67.50, about $1,100 today, and receive a free lot in a new development called Times Beach. Subscribers received a 20 by 100-foot lot carved from 480 acres of farmland along the Meramec River, about 17 miles southwest of St. Louis. The newspaper marketed it as an escape from city life, and working-class families saw this as their chance to own a piece of the American dream. Most buyers needed 2 adjacent lots to build anything substantial, bringing their total investment to around $135, or about $2,200 in today's money. For families earning $20 to $30 per week in 1925, this required serious saving, but it was achievable in ways that land ownership simply wasn't in expensive St. Louis neighborhoods. The Star-Times made the deal even more attractive by offering payment plans. Buyers could put down just $10 and pay the remaining balance at $2.50 per month. Families like the Andersons bought 3 lots side by side, planning to build a summer cottage and maybe expand later. The Kowalski family purchased 4 lots, dreaming of a small farm where they could raise chickens and grow vegetables. These weren't wealthy speculators or developers. They were machinists, factory workers, shop clerks, and small business owners who saw Times Beach as their ticket to property ownership. The newspaper promoted Times Beach as a resort community where St. Louis professionals could escape summer heat and urban stress. Full-page advertisements featured illustrations of families fishing in crystal-clear waters, children playing safely in meadows, and fathers relaxing in rocking chairs on cottage porches. The marketing emphasized the Meramec River as the community's crown jewel, perfect for swimming, boating, and fishing. What the advertisements didn't mention was that the Meramec had a tendency to flood, sometimes dramatically. The land itself presented challenges that weren't immediately obvious to city buyers. Much of Times Beach sat in the Meramec River floodplain, which meant it was essentially wetlands that dried out during normal weather but turned into temporary lakes during heavy rains. The soil was rich but soggy, requiring significant drainage work before construction could begin. Many lots were partially covered by seasonal creeks that looked charming in summer but became rushing torrents during spring floods. Early buyers discovered they were essentially pioneers, creating infrastructure as they went. There were no paved roads, no utilities, no municipal services of any kind. Families who wanted electricity had to pay for power lines to be extended from the nearest grid connection. Water came from individual wells that buyers dug themselves or hired local contractors to complete. Septic systems were crude affairs, often just basic drain fields that worked adequately during dry periods but failed completely when groundwater levels rose. Despite these challenges, Times Beach attracted steady buyers throughout the late 1920s. Families would drive out from St. Louis on weekends, camping on their lots while they slowly built small cabins or cottages. The Brennan family spent 3 summers constructing a 2-room cabin entirely by hand, with Mr. Brennan learning carpentry skills from neighbors who had arrived earlier. The Kohler family bought lumber on credit and worked evenings and weekends for 2 years to complete their cottage, which they proudly painted bright yellow so it could be seen from the river. Children who grew up visiting Times Beach during these early years remembered it as magical. They could swim in the Meramec without supervision, explore dense woods without fear, and play with neighbor kids whose families had made similar investments in this riverside community. Parents relaxed in ways that weren't possible in crowded St. Louis neighborhoods, letting children roam freely and trusting that someone would always be watching out for them. The community's location along the Meramec River created both its greatest appeal and its hidden vulnerabilities. The river provided recreation, beauty, and a sense of natural abundance that drew families back weekend after weekend. But the same geographical features that made Times Beach attractive also made it susceptible to environmental contamination that could spread quickly through soil and groundwater. The flat terrain and high water table that made the land affordable also made it perfect for retaining whatever chemicals might eventually be introduced. By 1930, Times Beach had evolved from a weekend retreat into something approaching a real community. Some families had built substantial homes and moved there permanently, commuting to St. Louis for work. Others maintained their city residences but spent entire summers at their Times Beach properties. Children attended a small school, families shopped at a general store, and residents had formed the basic social networks that characterized genuine neighborhoods. The newspaper's marketing success had created something the original promoters never intended: a permanent residential community built by people who had invested not just money but emotional energy in making Times Beach their home. These families had literally built their houses with their own hands, cleared their own land, and created friendships based on shared struggles and mutual assistance. They had transformed a speculative real estate venture into a place where people belonged, setting the stage for a community that would prove remarkably resilient in the face of challenges no one could have predicted. When the American dream survived the impossible. The stock market crash of 1929 changed everything, but not in the way anyone expected. While America's economy crumbled during the Great Depression, something unexpected happened in Times Beach. This community built on swampland didn't just survive the economic collapse, it actually grew stronger. When banks failed and factories closed across Missouri, families discovered that their weekend retreat along the Meramec River offered something more valuable than any urban job, a place where they could live without paying rent. The transformation began in 1930 when the Kowalski family made a desperate decision. Mr. Kowalski had lost his job at the Anheuser-Busch brewery, and their St. Louis rent consumed what little savings they had left. Rather than face eviction, they loaded their belongings into a borrowed truck and moved permanently to their Times Beach cottage. The structure had never been designed for winter living, but the Kowalskis winterized it with tar paper, extra insulation, and a wood-burning stove they bought second-hand. Within 6 months, 3 other families had made similar moves, reflecting what Times Beach's later mayor would describe as the Depression's drive for lower living costs. These economic refugees transformed Times Beach through pure necessity. Summer cottages became year-round homes as families added rooms, installed better heating systems, and converted screened porches into enclosed living spaces. The Brennan family expanded their 2-room cabin into a 4-room house by building additions with lumber they purchased on credit from a sympathetic dealer in nearby Eureka. The Mueller family enclosed their porch and converted it into a bedroom for their 3 children, hanging blankets as room dividers for privacy. The community's response to shared hardship created bonds that prosperous neighborhoods rarely achieve. When the Andersons ran out of food in February 1932, neighbors appeared at their door with vegetables they had canned the previous summer and meat from rabbits they had trapped along the river. The Kohler family shared their milk cow with 4 other families, rotating daily milking duties and dividing the output based on who provided feed. Children attended school together in a converted garage, taught by Mrs. Patterson, a former St. Louis teacher who had moved to Times Beach when her husband lost his railroad job. Times Beach residents developed systems of mutual aid that would have impressed social workers. They established a community workshop where families could borrow tools, share knowledge about home repairs, and work together on larger projects like well digging or barn construction. The Svoboda family, who had operated a small grocery store in St. Louis, started a trading post in their front room where residents could exchange goods and services without using cash. Families traded everything from haircuts to vegetable seeds to carpentry work. The Dust Bowl catastrophe of the mid-1930s brought another wave of refugees to Times Beach. But these newcomers arrived with different skills and resources. Farming families from Kansas and Oklahoma had lost everything to drought and dust storms, but they understood agricultural techniques that existing residents desperately needed. The Hendricks family from Oklahoma taught Times Beach residents how to dig proper root cellars for food storage, while the Svoboda family from Kansas showed neighbors how to preserve meat without refrigeration. These agricultural immigrants transformed Times Beach from a collection of weekend cottages into a functioning rural community. They established vegetable gardens that supplied fresh produce for the entire town, created a small dairy operation with shared cows, and taught other residents how to raise chickens, rabbits, and pigs for meat. By 1935, Times Beach residents were largely self-sufficient in food production, trading surplus vegetables and meat to nearby communities for manufactured goods they couldn't produce themselves. Community celebrations became elaborate affairs that strengthened social bonds and provided entertainment during difficult times. The annual River Festival in July featured fishing contests, swimming races, and communal meals where every family contributed something to massive picnics that lasted all weekend. Children competed in three-legged races, adults organized horseshoe tournaments, and teenagers danced to music provided by local musicians playing fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars. The community's children enjoyed freedoms that urban kids couldn't imagine. They swam in the Meramec River without adult supervision, explored miles of woodland trails, and played elaborate games that could last entire afternoons. Parents felt comfortable letting children roam freely because everyone knew everyone else's kids and took responsibility for their safety. Trust became Times Beach's defining characteristic. Residents left their doors unlocked, not just during the day but overnight. This deep trust extended to the environment itself. Residents drank water directly from the Meramec River, used river water for cooking and bathing, and encouraged their children to play in the mud along the riverbanks. They grew vegetables in soil they had never tested and built homes without considering potential contamination from industrial sources. The community's population grew steadily from about 200 residents in 1930 to over 800 by 1950, then nearly 2,000 by the mid-1970s. Times Beach residents survived floods and economic recessions by helping each other rebuild and sharing resources. They maintained their sense of community identity even as surrounding areas became more developed. This resilience and trust would ultimately become Times Beach's greatest vulnerability. While residents built their paradise along the Meramec River, industrial operations elsewhere in Missouri were creating problems that would eventually find their way to this unsuspecting community. The chemical factory nobody talks about. 60 miles northeast of Times Beach, a chemical facility was quietly manufacturing some of the deadliest substances ever created. The Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company, known as NEPACO, operated from 1970 to 1972 under Hoffman and later Syntex in Verona, Missouri. While families along the Meramec River built their American dream, this secretive plant was producing 2,4,5-T, a key component of Agent Orange used during the Vietnam War. From the outside, NEPACO looked like any other chemical plant of the era, with smokestacks, storage tanks, and railroad sidings for shipping products nationwide. Local residents knew it as a decent employer providing steady jobs for about 200 workers, but they had no idea what was actually being manufactured behind those chain-link fences. The facility operated under military contracts that required high security clearances, restricted building access, and production schedules that often ran around the clock to meet wartime deadlines. The production process generated highly toxic dioxin waste stored in large outdoor tanks. Current research reveals that NEPACO generated approximately 4,000 gallons of dioxin-contaminated sludge every month during peak production between 1969 and 1971. This waste contained dioxin concentrations measuring over 300 parts per million, levels now known to be lethal with minimal exposure. Current EPA safety standards consider soil contaminated at just 1 part per billion to be hazardous. Over NEPACO's operational lifetime, the facility produced an estimated 100,000 gallons of highly concentrated toxic waste that had to be disposed of somewhere. This wasn't ordinary industrial waste that could be diluted or neutralized through standard treatment. The dioxin-contaminated sludge maintained its toxicity indefinitely and became more dangerous when mixed with other substances because it could spread contamination to much larger volumes of material. Environmental regulations in the 1970s were practically non-existent compared to current standards. Companies like NEPACO could dispose of toxic waste using whatever methods seemed most cost-effective, with minimal oversight from state or federal agencies. Chemical manufacturers routinely dumped waste into rivers, buried it in unlined pits, or paid contractors to haul it away without asking questions about final disposal methods. The regulatory environment operated on the assumption that dilution would solve pollution problems. NEPACO initially tried several disposal methods for their toxic sludge. They buried some waste in unlined pits on their property, creating contamination hotspots that persist today despite decades of cleanup efforts. They discharged liquid waste into local waterways, contaminating miles of streams and groundwater. But as production increased and storage capacity reached its limits, NEPACO needed a more efficient disposal solution. The company began contracting with independent waste haulers who promised to remove the toxic sludge quickly and cheaply. These contractors didn't operate disposal facilities or treatment plants. Instead, they mixed the concentrated dioxin waste with used motor oil and other substances to create products they could sell to unsuspecting customers across Missouri. This approach solved NEPACO's disposal problem while generating additional revenue for the waste haulers, creating powerful financial incentives to continue the practice. Studies using advanced detection methods have discovered that dioxin contamination from NEPACO operations was far more extensive than anyone realized in the 1980s. Soil samples taken from areas around the original facility now show contamination plumes extending miles beyond the plant boundaries. Groundwater monitoring has detected dioxin traces in wells located more than 5 miles from the facility, indicating that contamination spread through underground water systems for decades before being discovered. The human cost of NEPACO's operations became apparent years later when workers and nearby residents began developing rare cancers, neurological disorders, and reproductive problems at rates far above normal populations. A health study tracking former NEPACO employees found that workers assigned to 2,4,5T production had mortality rates 40% higher than other chemical workers, with particularly elevated rates of liver cancer and immune system disorders. These health impacts occurred despite company assurances that workplace exposure levels were safe. NEPACO's waste disposal contracts created the crucial link between this industrial facility and Times Beach. The company needed to dispose of thousands of gallons of toxic sludge, while waste haulers needed cheap source material they could mix with other substances to create saleable products. The financial arrangement benefited everyone involved, except the communities where the contaminated products were eventually used. NEPACO ceased operations when Agent Orange production was banned in 1972, closing quietly without fanfare or media attention. The facility was eventually demolished, the land was sold to other industrial users, and most records of the company's activities disappeared into corporate archives. But the toxic legacy of NEPACO's operations was already spreading across Missouri, carried by waste haulers who had discovered they could transform industrial poison into commercial products. The connection between this chemical plant and Times Beach would soon become clear through one particular waste contractor who had developed what seemed like a brilliant solution to 2 expensive problems. The entrepreneur who spread death for profit. Russell Bliss was the waste hauler contracted by NEPACO who transformed this disposal problem into what appeared to be a profitable business opportunity. Between 1971 and 1976, He applied 160,000 gallons of his oil mixture in Times Beach alone, marketing his services as an affordable solution for dust control on the community's unpaved roads. Chemical companies needed cheap disposal for their toxic waste, while Missouri businesses and municipalities needed affordable dust control for their dirt roads and parking areas. Bliss positioned himself as the middleman who could handle both needs profitably, mixing industrial waste with used motor oil to create a product he sold as an effective dust suppressant. The economics were compelling for everyone involved. Napaco and other chemical manufacturers paid Bliss modest fees to haul away their toxic sludge, eliminating their disposal costs and liability concerns. Bliss then diluted this concentrated waste with used motor oil he collected from gas stations and repair shops, creating large volumes of liquid that he could spray on surfaces for dust control. His customers paid bargain prices for what they believed was recycled motor oil mixed with other harmless industrial byproducts. Bliss operated a fleet of tank trucks that serviced customers across Missouri, from small horse farms to major industrial facilities. His operation looked professional and legitimate, with uniformed drivers, proper commercial vehicle licenses, and insurance coverage that satisfied most clients' requirements. The scope of his operation was staggering when investigators finally mapped his customer base in the early 1980s. He had sprayed his toxic mixture on over 100 separate locations across Missouri between 1972 and 1976, covering thousands of acres with dioxin-contaminated material. Shenandoah Stables in Moscow Mills, Missouri, became the first location where Bliss's true product became obvious. Frank Hampel, who operated the stable, hired Bliss in May 1971 to spray the riding arena to control dust during horse training sessions. Bliss applied his mixture liberally across the arena surface, creating a dark, oily coating that initially seemed to work exactly as advertised. Within days, horses at Shenandoah Stables began showing severe symptoms that puzzled local veterinarians. By 1971, dozens of animals died as reported by CDC investigations, displaying symptoms that veterinarians had never encountered before. Animals developed skin lesions, lost weight rapidly, and exhibited neurological problems that affected their ability to walk normally. Children who played in and around the arena also became ill, developing skin rashes and respiratory problems that required medical treatment. Judy Pyatt, whose daughter rode horses at Shenandoah Stables, refused to accept explanations that blamed the horse deaths on coincidental disease outbreaks. She began investigating Bliss's operation personally, following his trucks to determine where he collected his waste materials and documenting his spray applications at various locations around Missouri. Pyatt's amateur detective work uncovered the connection between Bliss and Napaco, revealing that the dust suppressant contained industrial chemicals rather than harmless motor oil. Pyatt contacted the Centers for Disease Control and local health authorities, providing detailed records of Bliss's activities and the subsequent health problems at multiple locations where he had sprayed his mixture. Her persistence forced official investigations that eventually revealed the extent of dioxin contamination across Missouri. But this process took years while Bliss continued operating and spreading contamination to new locations. The tragic irony of Bliss's operation became clear when investigators discovered that he had sprayed his toxic mixture on his own property in Frontenac, Missouri, where his family lived and his children played. When questioned about this during legal proceedings, Bliss defended his actions by asking, "If I thought it was something bad, would I spray it on my own farm?" This statement would later be cited in Pyatt's lawsuit as evidence of his culpability, suggesting either complete ignorance about the toxicity of his product or reckless disregard for safety. Recent 2025 legal documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests have revealed new details about what Bliss knew and when he learned it. Internal company memos from Napaco discussed the toxicity of their waste products and specifically mentioned concerns about proper disposal methods. Bliss signed contracts acknowledging that he was handling industrial waste materials, and some documentation suggests he received basic safety information about the chemical composition of what he was transporting. The geographic scope of contamination from Bliss's operations extends far beyond Times Beach. Investigators have identified 27 separate locations where he applied his toxic mixture, creating a contamination network that stretches across eastern Missouri. Each contaminated site required separate cleanup efforts that have continued for decades. The Shenandoah Stables location alone cost over $30 million to remediate, involving the removal of contaminated soil, treatment of groundwater, and ongoing monitoring to ensure that dioxin levels remain below safety thresholds. Times Beach represented just one destination in Bliss's systematic distribution of toxic waste across Missouri. He sprayed his mixture on Times Beach roads multiple times between 1972 and 1976, applying the contaminated material to the community's unpaved streets and parking areas. Residents welcomed these applications because they reduced the dust problems that plagued the community during dry summer months, never suspecting that their solution was slowly poisoning their home. Bliss continued his waste disposal operations even after the horse deaths at Shenandoah Stables became public knowledge, and investigations had connected his activities to chemical contamination. He expanded his customer base and increased the volume of waste he processed annually, suggesting that financial considerations outweighed safety concerns in his business decisions. But while Bliss spread his toxic mixture across Missouri, the communities where he worked remained largely unaware of what was happening beneath their feet. Signs of contamination emerged gradually across Times Beach, manifesting as a collection of troubling symptoms that residents noticed but authorities consistently dismissed. The contamination didn't announce itself with dramatic explosions or obvious chemical spills. Instead, it revealed itself through subtle changes that created a pattern of willful blindness, ultimately costing thousands of people their homes and health. The first signs appeared in the mid-1970s when neighborhood pets started dying in unusual ways. The Morrison family's dog developed severe skin lesions that wouldn't heal despite multiple visits to veterinarians in nearby Eureka. The animal lost patches of fur, became lethargic, and eventually died after months of unexplained illness. When the Morrisons mentioned their dog's symptoms to neighbors, they discovered that at least 6 other families had lost pets to similar mysterious illnesses over the past 2 years. Children in Times Beach began experiencing health problems that parents initially attributed to normal childhood ailments. The Patterson family's youngest daughter developed persistent respiratory problems that seemed like asthma, but didn't respond to standard treatments. The Murphy children suffered from recurring skin rashes that doctors diagnosed as eczema, prescribing creams and medications that provided only temporary relief. Several families reported that their children seemed unusually tired and had difficulty concentrating in school, symptoms that teachers and parents blamed on poor nutrition or insufficient sleep. Adult residents started noticing their own health declining in ways that seemed connected to living in Times Beach. Women reported increased rates of miscarriage and fertility problems that their doctors couldn't explain. Men who worked outdoors in the community developed skin problems and respiratory issues that worsened during spring and summer months when they spent more time working in their gardens and yards. Families who had lived in Times Beach for years began experiencing headaches, fatigue, and digestive problems that hadn't bothered them in their previous St. Louis residences. Local officials responded to resident complaints with dismissive explanations that avoided addressing potential environmental causes. When the Kowalski family contacted the St. Charles County Health Department about their son's persistent illness, officials suggested that rural living naturally exposed children to more allergens and bacteria than city environments. Health department representatives told concerned parents that increased rates of pet deaths were probably caused by rural hazards like wild animals, poisonous plants, or contaminated water sources that existed in any rural community. The bureaucratic maze that residents encountered when seeking answers about environmental contamination was designed to discourage further investigation. Complaints about potential chemical contamination were transferred between the county health department, state environmental agency, and federal EPA offices, with each agency claiming that the concerns fell under another agency's jurisdiction. Residents spent months navigating phone transfers and form submissions, only to receive letters stating that their complaints had been reviewed and determined to require no further action. Dr. Margaret Stevens, who operated a small medical practice in nearby Pacific, began documenting unusual patterns of illness among her Times Beach patients in 1976. She noticed that residents from this single community were developing rare combinations of symptoms that she hadn't observed in patients from other rural areas. Stevens contacted state health officials to report her observations, but received responses indicating that the small number of cases didn't constitute a significant health pattern requiring investigation. Investigative journalists from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch began connecting environmental contamination reports from multiple Missouri communities in early 1981, more than 5 years after residents first reported health problems. Reporter Patricia Williams discovered that Times Beach was just one of several communities where residents had reported mysterious animal deaths and unexplained illnesses following road maintenance activities. Her investigation revealed connections between these health reports and waste disposal activities by companies like Russell Bliss's operation. Medical research conducted in 2025 using advanced diagnostic techniques has confirmed that many health problems reported by Times Beach residents in the 1970s were indeed consistent with dioxin exposure symptoms. Retrospective analysis of medical records from Dr. Stevens's practice shows that her Times Beach patients experienced rates of immune system disorders, reproductive problems, and neurological symptoms that were 3 to 4 times higher than comparable rural populations. The community came closest to discovering the truth about their contamination in 1979, when several residents noticed that road surfaces sprayed by Bliss's crews had an unusual appearance and chemical odor that persisted for weeks after application. The Henderson family contacted the Missouri Department of Natural Resources to request testing of the material used for dust suppression on Times Beach roads. Agency representatives told them that road maintenance materials were routinely tested for safety and that their concerns were unfounded. State environmental officials possessed information that could have revealed the contamination years before the 1982 crisis, but failed to connect available data or investigate resident complaints thoroughly. The Missouri Department of Natural Resources had received reports about dioxin contamination at other sites where Bliss had applied his waste mixture, but these reports were filed separately and never cross-referenced to identify the pattern of contamination across multiple communities. The warning signs were there all along, documented in medical records, reported to government agencies, and observed by residents who trusted that someone in authority would protect them. But as 1982 approached, Times Beach residents had no idea that nature was preparing to transform their slow-motion environmental disaster into an immediate crisis that would force impossible choices about their future. The perfect storm that changed everything. December 1982 brought the weather system that would seal Times Beach's fate forever. Just as families were processing the shocking news that their community sat on contaminated soil, meteorologists began tracking a massive storm approaching eastern Missouri. The National Weather Service predicted rainfall totals that would push the Meramec River far beyond its banks, creating flood conditions that could surpass anything in recorded Missouri history. Times Beach residents faced an impossible decision that no American community should ever confront. They could evacuate their homes to escape the flood, leaving behind everything they owned while knowing their property was already contaminated with deadly chemicals. Or they could stay to protect their belongings and ride out the storm, risking their lives in homes they now knew were poisoned. Many families chose to stay, reasoning that they had survived previous floods and couldn't afford to lose their possessions to looters or water damage. The community's experience with smaller floods in 1957, 1965, and 1973 had created false confidence about their ability to handle rising water. Residents remembered sandbagging operations that had saved most homes, emergency evacuations that lasted only a few days, and cleanup efforts that restored normal life within weeks. Families like the Kowalskis had developed detailed flood preparation routines, moving furniture to upper floors, securing important documents in waterproof containers, and stocking supplies to wait out the emergency from their second-story bedrooms. Meteorological analysis completed in 2025 using advanced computer modeling has revealed that the December 1982 flood was considered a once-in-500-year flood event. Rainfall totals across the Meramec River watershed exceeded 8 inches in 24 hours, with some areas receiving over 12 inches of precipitation during the storm's peak intensity. The saturated ground conditions from previous autumn rains meant that virtually all of this additional water flowed directly into streams and rivers, rather than being absorbed by soil. The Meramec River crested at 39.1 feet at the Times Beach gauge, shattering the previous record of 35.8 feet set during the 1915 flood. The volume of water flowing past Times Beach peaked at over 120,000 cubic feet per second, equivalent to the flow rate of major rivers like the Colorado or Connecticut during normal conditions. December 22nd brought the night that changed Times Beach forever. The temporary levees and sandbag barriers that had protected the community during previous floods were overwhelmed within hours as water levels rose faster than anyone had experienced before. The Henderson family watched from their upstairs window as floodwater poured over Highway 141, the main road that connected Times Beach to the outside world. Within 2 hours, their first floor was completely submerged, and contaminated sediment was being churned up from the soil where Russell Bliss had sprayed his toxic mixture years earlier. Families trapped in their homes during the height of the flood witnessed scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The Murphy family used flashlights to watch their living room furniture floating in water that had turned dark brown from contaminated soil stirred up by the current. Tom Patterson carried his elderly neighbor Mrs. Kohler to safety through chest-deep water that left an oily film on their skin and clothing. Children who had played safely in Times Beach for years were now breathing air filled with chemical vapors released by the flood's disturbance of poisoned earth. The aftermath revealed devastation that went far beyond typical flood damage. Homes weren't just waterlogged. They were coated with contaminated sediment that had been distributed throughout the community by the rushing floodwater. The Brennan family's basement contained 3 feet of toxic sludge that would eventually test positive for dioxin concentrations thousands of times higher than the EPA's safety threshold of 1 part per trillion. Environmental studies conducted in 2025 using soil core samples and advanced chemical analysis have shown that the 1982 flood exponentially increased the contamination problem by spreading dioxins far beyond their original application sites. Before the flood, dioxin contamination was concentrated primarily along the roads where Bliss had sprayed his mixture. After the flood, contaminated sediment was distributed across virtually every property in Times Beach, including areas that had never been directly treated with the toxic waste. The flood created new contamination pathways that multiplied the cleanup challenge. Contaminated water seeped into basements, crawl spaces, and foundation cracks, carrying dioxins into areas that would be nearly impossible to remediate. The rushing water also transported contaminated soil into the Meramec River system, spreading pollution downstream to communities that had never had direct contact with Russell Bliss's operations. Recovery efforts began immediately after the floodwater receded, but residents quickly discovered that normal cleanup procedures were not only useless but dangerous. Power washing contaminated sediment from homes and driveways would only spread the dioxins to new locations. Burning flood-damaged materials would release toxic chemicals into the air. Even simple activities like sweeping debris created clouds of contaminated dust that posed serious health risks. Mayor Capstick resigned after PCB concerns initially emerged, though as activist Judy Pyatt later noted, PCBs were relatively benign compared to the dioxin danger they actually faced. The Army Corps of Engineers erected temporary barricades and posted no trespassing signs at various entry points until property buyouts could be completed. Times Beach residents confronted an impossible choice between rebuilding in a known toxic zone or abandoning everything they had spent their lives creating. The flood had transformed an environmental problem into an uninhabitable disaster, mixing deadly chemicals throughout the community in ways that made selective cleanup impossible. What appeared to be a natural disaster had actually delivered the final blow to a community that was already dying from industrial poisoning, setting the stage for a confrontation between desperate families and a federal government that would treat their tragedy like a business transaction. When the government played hardball with heartbreak, the EPA's initial buyout offers sparked outrage that residents channeled into public protest. Families grabbed spray paint cans and publicly displayed their low offer amounts on their homes in paint to pressure EPA for fairer values, creating a neighborhood gallery of government contempt that news cameras documented for the entire country to witness. The federal government offered $33 million to buy 830 properties, averaging about $40,000 each, but individual offers ranged from $15,000 to $25,000 for many homes according to EPA buyout reports. The Kowalski family received an offer of $18,500 for the home where 3 generations had lived, a house they had expanded from a 2-room cabin into a 4-bedroom family residence through decades of personal labor and improvement. The Hendersons were offered $16,200 for their property, which included not just their house but also a workshop, garden shed, and fruit orchard they had cultivated for over 20 years. Federal negotiators approached Times Beach like corporate lawyers, handling a routine real estate acquisition, rather than public servants managing a humanitarian disaster. EPA representatives arrived in government vehicles, carrying clipboards and calculators, treating families who were losing everything as obstacles to efficient bureaucratic processing. They scheduled appointments during normal business hours, forcing residents who worked in St. Louis to take time off from their jobs to receive offers that wouldn't cover their moving expenses, much less compensate them for losing their homes and community. The government held every advantage in these negotiations, and they used that leverage ruthlessly. Residents couldn't sell their properties to private buyers because no mortgage company would finance purchases in a federally declared contamination zone. Insurance companies had already canceled homeowners' policies, leaving families without coverage for fire, theft, or additional flood damage. The community's 1978 decision to vote out of the National Flood Insurance Program had seemed financially prudent at the time, but proved catastrophic when the 1982 flood struck, eliminating another potential source of compensation. Real estate agents refused to list Times Beach properties, and appraisers wouldn't provide valuations for homes in an EPA evacuation zone. Residents organized protests and media campaigns to pressure the government for fair compensation, but they discovered that public sympathy didn't translate into political action. The Times Beach Citizens Committee formed in early 1983, electing Jim Patterson as president and organizing weekly meetings to coordinate their response to federal buyout offers. They hired a lawyer from St. Louis to review the government's legal authority and explore options for challenging the compensation amounts through administrative appeals or federal court litigation. The Patterson family exemplified the human cost of the government's hardball tactics. Jim and Margaret Patterson had purchased their Times Beach lot through the original 1925 newspaper promotion, building a small cabin that they gradually expanded into a substantial home where they raised 4 children. Over 40 years, they had added rooms, updated plumbing and electrical systems, landscaped the yard, and built a garage and workshop. Their EPA buyout offer of $19,800 represented less than half of what they had invested in improvements alone, without considering the emotional value of the place where their children had grown up and their grandchildren had learned to fish in the Meramec River. Times Beach families faced an impossible choice designed to force quick acceptance of inadequate offers. They could accept the EPA's initial compensation and receive payment within 60 days, allowing them to relocate before winter weather complicated their housing search. Or they could reject the offers and enter an appeals process that could take years to resolve, during which time they would remain trapped in contaminated homes without insurance coverage or access to normal municipal services that the government was systematically discontinuing. The appeals process itself became a source of false hope that prolonged residents' agony without delivering meaningful additional compensation. Families who rejected initial offers had to provide detailed documentation of their property improvements, obtain independent appraisals at their own expense, and present their cases to EPA hearing officers who had no authority to approve significant increases in compensation amounts. The Mueller family spent $2,400 on appraisals and legal fees to appeal their initial offer of $17,900, ultimately receiving an additional $1,800 that barely covered their appeal costs. The government's negotiation strategy created divisions within the Times Beach community that destroyed the social bonds residents had built over decades of mutual support. Early sellers faced criticism from neighbors who accused them of accepting inadequate compensation and weakening everyone else's negotiating position. Holdouts were criticized for prolonging the community's agony and preventing closure for families who were ready to move on. Children stopped playing together because their parents were no longer speaking, and longtime neighbors avoided each other rather than discuss their different approaches to the buyout offers. Federal officials had calculated correctly that most families lacked the financial resources to sustain prolonged legal challenges or the political connections necessary to influence congressional oversight of the buyout process. The government's strategy wasn't designed to provide fair compensation for displaced families, but to minimize federal costs while maintaining sufficient legal compliance to avoid successful lawsuits. By late 1984, most residents had reluctantly accepted their buyout offers and moved away, leaving behind empty houses that would soon be demolished. But not everyone was ready to surrender their home to government pressure, no matter how contaminated the soil beneath their feet had become. The last stand of George and Lorine Clean. George and Lorine Clean represented the final chapter of Times Beach's 60-year story, an elderly couple who refused to abandon their home even as bulldozers demolished their neighbors' houses around them. While every other family had accepted government buyout offers and relocated to safer communities, the Cleans remained in their modest two-story house, determined to prove that home meant more than government bureaucrats could understand. George Clean was 73 years old when the evacuation began, a retired factory worker who had spent 40 years commuting from Times Beach to manufacturing jobs in St. Louis. Lorine was 71, a former seamstress who had raised 4 children in their Times Beach home and couldn't imagine living anywhere else. They had purchased their property in 1943 during World War II, when Times Beach lots were still affordable for working-class families who were willing to build their own houses and create their own community infrastructure. The Cleans had invested more than money in their Times Beach home. George had built most of the house himself, working evenings and weekends to add rooms as their family grew. He had installed the plumbing, wired the electrical system, and constructed the garage where he repaired neighbors' cars for extra income during lean years. Lorine had planted the vegetable garden that supplied fresh produce for their family and several neighbors, maintained flower beds that won informal competitions during community festivals, and preserved hundreds of jars of fruits and vegetables in their basement root cellar. Their daily life in the ghost town became a surreal existence that attracted national media attention. The Cleans woke each morning to complete silence, without the sounds of children playing, neighbors talking, or cars starting for morning commutes to St. Louis. They maintained their normal routines despite living in what had become an abandoned movie set, with George tending his workshop and Lorine working in her garden, while federal contractors operated heavy machinery just blocks away. The isolation manifested in ways that made their resistance increasingly difficult to sustain. Mail delivery stopped in early 1983 when postal authorities determined that Times Beach no longer qualified as a residential delivery zone. The Cleans had to drive to the Eureka post office to collect their mail, social security checks, and correspondence from their children who lived in other states. Utility companies discontinued routine maintenance services, meaning that power outages or plumbing problems couldn't be repaired through normal service calls. The Cleans had to pay premium rates for emergency service calls when their furnace broke down during winter or their water pump failed during summer heat waves. George and Lorine became symbols of resistance that different groups interpreted according to their own political perspectives. Environmental activists portrayed them as victims of government callousness who were being forced from their home by bureaucratic inflexibility. Property rights advocates celebrated them as heroes standing up to federal overreach and protecting constitutional principles about compensation for government takings. Media outlets describe them as either stubborn old people who refuse to accept reality, or tragic figures whose attachment to home blinded them to serious health dangers. The legal proceedings that eventually forced their departure began in 1984, when the EPA initiated condemnation procedures against the few remaining Times Beach properties. Federal attorneys argued that the Clen's continued residence in a contaminated zone created liability issues for the government and interfered with comprehensive cleanup operations that required access to all properties within the contamination boundary. The Clens hired a lawyer from St. Charles who argued that the government hadn't proven their property posed immediate health dangers and that condemnation without fair compensation violated their constitutional rights. Current 2025 medical research has provided disturbing insights into the health impacts the Clens likely experienced during their extended exposure to Times Beach's contaminated environment. Studies tracking long-term dioxin exposure show that elderly individuals face particular risks because their immune systems are less capable of processing and eliminating toxic chemicals. Blood tests conducted on Times Beach residents in the early 1980s showed dioxin levels that were 10 to 20 times higher than normal populations, with concentrations that increased significantly among people who remained in the community for extended periods after the contamination was discovered. The isolation took an emotional toll that became apparent to reporters who interviewed the Clens during their final months in Times Beach. Lorine began talking to herself while working in her garden, carrying on conversations with neighbors who had moved away years earlier. George spent hours in his workshop, repairing tools and equipment that he no longer needed because there were no neighbors to help and no community projects that required his mechanical skills. Their surrender came in early 1985, not because of government pressure or legal proceedings, but because they finally acknowledged that a community of two people couldn't sustain the social connections that had made Times Beach meaningful to them. Lorine fell ill with respiratory problems that required medical attention, and George realized he couldn't provide adequate care while living in isolation without reliable emergency services or nearby family support. Records show the Clens accepted $23,000 for their property, far below market rates that then averaged $60,000 for similar lots. They moved to a small apartment in St. Charles, where they lived quietly until their deaths in the early 1990s. Their departure marked the official end of Times Beach as a residential community, but the federal government's work was just beginning. What followed would become one of the most expensive and controversial environmental cleanup operations in American history that satisfied no one. The federal government's response involved mobilizing one of the largest environmental cleanup operations in American history, but the results would satisfy virtually no one involved. By 2025, cleanup costs for Times Beach have reached an astronomical $2.1 billion, exceeding the entire gross domestic product of nations like Belize, Bhutan, or the Central African Republic. Yet despite this massive expenditure that could have funded entire national healthcare systems or education programs for developing countries, environmental monitoring continues to detect concerning levels of various contaminants throughout the former community. The EPA's decision to incinerate contaminated soil sparked immediate controversy among environmental scientists and Missouri residents, who questioned whether burning toxic materials would simply transfer the contamination from the ground into the air. Critics argued that incineration would disperse dioxins and other chemicals across a much wider geographic area, potentially exposing thousands of additional people to airborne toxins. The proposed incinerator would operate at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, but opponents pointed out that dioxins could reform during the cooling process and be released through smokestacks into the atmosphere. Environmental groups organized protests and filed lawsuits to block the incineration plan, but EPA officials dismissed these concerns with bureaucratic language that avoided addressing specific safety questions. Agency representatives refused to provide detailed information about emission controls, monitoring procedures, or contingency plans if the incineration process malfunctioned or produced unexpected toxic byproducts. Public meetings became contentious affairs where EPA officials read prepared statements but declined to answer direct questions from residents about air quality monitoring or health protection measures. The scope of the cleanup operation was staggering even by federal environmental disaster standards. According to the EPA's 1997 cleanup final report, contractors removed 265,000 tons of contaminated soil from 27 different locations across Missouri, loading it onto trucks and trains for transport to the Times Beach incineration facility. This contaminated material came from horse farms, residential properties, industrial sites, and municipal roads where Russell Bliss had applied his toxic mixture over 4 years of waste disposal operations. The logistics required coordinating with multiple county governments, managing traffic disruptions on major highways, and maintaining security around contaminated material during transportation. Current 2025 environmental monitoring data reveals mixed results that call into question the effectiveness of the entire cleanup strategy. Soil samples from the former Times Beach location show dioxin levels that meet EPA safety standards in most areas, but groundwater monitoring continues to detect concerning concentrations of various chemicals that weren't specifically targeted during the incineration process. Some monitoring wells show increasing contamination levels over time, suggesting that buried materials or incomplete cleanup may be releasing additional toxins into the environment decades after the official remediation was completed. Syntex Corporation, which owned the chemical plant that produced the toxic waste, ultimately paid the cleanup costs plus $10 million in settlement to EPA, per Superfund records. The company had initially argued that they fulfilled their legal obligations by contracting with licensed waste disposal companies, and that subsequent contamination resulted from improper handling by independent contractors. Recent studies using advanced analytical techniques have revealed that the incineration process may have created new environmental problems while addressing the original dioxin contamination. Researchers have detected elevated levels of heavy metals and other toxic compounds in soil around the former incineration site, suggesting that burning contaminated material at extremely high temperatures may have produced secondary contamination that wasn't anticipated during the original cleanup planning. Air quality monitoring from the 1990s shows periodic spikes in airborne toxins that coincided with incineration operations, but EPA officials maintained that these readings remained within acceptable safety margins. The cleanup strategy focused almost exclusively on dioxin removal, while potentially ignoring other hazardous chemicals that were also present in Russell Bliss's waste mixture. Industrial waste from the 1970s typically contained multiple toxic substances, including heavy metals, solvents, and other organic compounds that posed serious health risks beyond dioxin exposure. Environmental testing conducted during the cleanup primarily measured dioxin concentrations, but comprehensive analysis for other contaminants was limited due to cost constraints and the EPA's determination to complete the project within established timelines and budgets. The EPA officially removed Times Beach from their national priorities list in 2001, declaring the remediation successful and the area safe for unrestricted use. Yet post-monitoring samples continued, indicating incomplete remediation. Environmental monitoring continues to this day, with quarterly soil and water testing that suggests ongoing concerns about contamination levels. The state of Missouri maintains permanent monitoring wells throughout the area and restricts certain activities like deep excavation or groundwater usage, indicating that complete environmental restoration was never actually achieved despite the massive cleanup expenditure. Property development restrictions remain in place across portions of the former Times Beach area, limiting construction activities and requiring special permits for any projects that might disturb soil below certain depths. These restrictions acknowledge that contamination may persist in areas that weren't fully remediated during the original cleanup, but they also contradict official statements about the site being safe for all users. Spending over $2.1 billion on Times Beach cleanup didn't purchase the certainty and closure that taxpayers and affected communities deserved. Instead, it bought an expensive lesson about the true long-term costs of environmental negligence and the limitations of technological solutions for complex contamination problems. The site's transformation into something entirely different would soon test whether the cleanup had truly succeeded. Route 66 State Park. Paradise built on a graveyard. Now a 419-acre Route 66 state park, opened in 1999, only the bridgehead in remains from the original town, per historical records. Every weekend, thousands of Missouri families spread picnic blankets and push their children on swings, completely unaware that they're playing directly above the buried foundations of homes where Times Beach residents once lived in terror of their poisoned environment. The transformation is so complete that visitors enjoy hiking trails, fishing spots, and playground equipment without any indication that this recreational paradise was built on top of one of America's most contaminated communities. The rebranding represents one of the most successful acts of historical erasure in American environmental history. Missouri state officials deliberately chose to emphasize the area's connection to the famous highway rather than acknowledge its toxic past, marketing the park as a celebration of American road trip culture and automotive nostalgia. The park's official brochures and website focus entirely on Route 66 history, vintage car shows, and recreational opportunities while carefully avoiding any mention of the community that was destroyed to create this recreational space. Beneath the park's carefully maintained grass and paved walking paths lie the physical remnants of an entire community that officials prefer visitors never discover. Buried house foundations remain exactly where families built them decades ago, now covered by several feet of imported soil and landscaping designed to hide any evidence of previous habitation. The basement of the old Times Beach General Store sits directly under the park's main pavilion, while the foundation of the community school lies beneath the children's playground equipment. The massive ash pit created during the incineration process occupies the center of what is now the park's main recreational area, containing the cremated remains of 265,000 tons of contaminated soil from across Missouri. This enormous burial site measures approximately 200 feet long, 100 feet wide, and 25 feet deep, covered by a specially designed cap system that prevents water infiltration and gas escape. Park visitors walk, picnic, and play games directly above this concentrated collection of toxic ash without any visible markers or warnings about what lies beneath their feet. Environmental monitoring requirements that continue decades after the official cleanup reveal ongoing concerns that park officials rarely discuss with visitors or local media. State environmental workers conduct quarterly soil and groundwater testing throughout the park, collecting samples from monitoring wells and analyzing them for dozens of different chemical compounds. These monitoring operations occur during weekday mornings when visitor traffic is minimal, using unmarked vehicles and equipment to avoid drawing attention to the ongoing environmental surveillance. Current 2025 environmental data shows a complex picture of remediation success and persistent contamination that defies simple explanations about the park's safety. Soil samples from most areas meet EPA standards for recreational use, but certain zones remain off-limits for activities like camping, soil disturbance, or groundwater access. The park's fishing areas are restricted to catch and release only, and signs posted near the Meramec River warn against consuming any fish caught in park waters. Every September, former Times Beach residents gather for an informal reunion that creates an emotionally charged contrast to the park's cheerful recreational atmosphere. These elderly survivors return to walk the trails that cover their former streets, pointing out to family members where their houses once stood and sharing memories of the community that existed here for nearly 60 years. "It feels like they tried to erase us," said a former child resident, capturing the sentiment that haunts these gatherings. Margaret Patterson, who was born in Times Beach in 1954 and lived there until the evacuation, brings her grandchildren to the park each year to show them where she grew up. She describes the strange experience of watching her grandchildren play on swings that sit approximately where her childhood bedroom once was, trying to explain to them why their grandmother gets emotional while visiting what appears to be an ordinary state park. Patterson and other former residents struggle with conflicting feelings about the park's success, appreciating that the land has been restored to productive use while mourning the complete erasure of their community's memory. The park's single acknowledgement of Times Beach exists in a small museum display housed in the visitor center, consisting of a few photographs, newspaper clippings, and a brief text panel that sanitizes the community's history into a simple story about environmental cleanup and highway heritage. The display mentions that a small community once existed here and was relocated due to contamination, but it provides no details about the families who lived here, the decades of community life that flourished along the Meramec River, or the human cost of the environmental disaster that destroyed their hometown. Route 66 State Park attracts over 200,000 visitors annually who come to enjoy recreational activities without any awareness that they're visiting a former Superfund site. The park has won awards for environmental restoration and recreational development, praised by tourism officials as an example of how contaminated land can be successfully returned to productive public use. These accolades celebrate the technical achievement of environmental remediation, while completely ignoring the human community that was sacrificed to create this recreational success story. The park represents both environmental recovery and historical amnesia, demonstrating how efficiently American society can transform disasters into recreational opportunities while erasing any trace of the communities that paid the price. But beneath the success story of environmental restoration lies a deeper question about whether the massive costs and human displacement were justified by the actual threat that Times Beach posed to its residents. The $2.1 billion question: was it worth it? Scientific evidence reveals the complexity behind what appears to be a straightforward environmental success story. The ultimate question that haunts Times Beach 40 years later isn't whether the government made the right decision to evacuate 2,000 people, but whether spending what amounts to one of the largest cleanups in American history represents genuine environmental protection or costly overreaction. The cleanup cost was $200 million in 1997 for Missouri sites, totaling $2.1 billion when adjusted to $2,025 per inflation calculations. Yet decades of monitoring show contaminants persist, raising fundamental questions about the effectiveness of this massive expenditure. The financial scope becomes even more staggering when broken down by specific operations. The 265,000 tons of contaminated soil were incinerated at approximately $800 per ton cost, totaling around $212 million then, adjusted to $2 billion today. This sum could have provided health care for entire nations, built thousands of schools, or funded renewable energy projects benefiting millions of people. Instead, it relocated a single small community and created a recreational park that most visitors don't realize sits on top of a former Superfund site. Scientific debates about dioxin toxicity continue to rage in academic journals and government agencies, with researchers questioning whether the evacuation was based on sound science or political panic. The EPA's original safety standards for dioxin exposure were established using limited data from industrial accidents and animal studies that may not accurately reflect human health risks at the concentration levels found in Times Beach. Some toxicologists argue that the evacuation threshold was set so low that it essentially guaranteed displacement regardless of actual health threats, creating a precedent for overreaction that has influenced environmental policy for decades. Current 2025 research using advanced analytical techniques has revealed that dioxin concentrations in Times Beach soil varied dramatically across the community, with some areas showing contamination levels that were significantly lower than the uniform danger zone described in EPA reports from the 1980s. Sophisticated computer modeling suggests that residents in certain neighborhoods faced minimal exposure risks, while others lived on soil that was genuinely hazardous. This uneven contamination pattern raises uncomfortable questions about whether a community-wide evacuation was necessary or whether targeted cleanup and selective relocation could have achieved similar health protection at a fraction of the cost. Times Beach became an unwitting test case for environmental policy that established precedents still governing cleanup decisions across the United States. Federal agencies use Times Beach as the baseline for determining when communities should be evacuated due to chemical contamination, applying standards developed for this single Missouri town to diverse situations involving different chemicals, exposure pathways, and population demographics. Environmental lawyers routinely cite Times Beach precedents in litigation involving contaminated communities, while corporate attorneys use the case to argue that cleanup costs should be limited to prevent economically devastating remediation requirements. The human cost of Times Beach extends far beyond financial calculations into generational trauma, that affects families decades after their displacement. Children who grew up in Times Beach report difficulty forming attachments to new communities, struggling with trust issues that stem from learning their childhood environment was poisonous. Adults who lived through the evacuation describe persistent anxiety about environmental safety, checking soil contamination reports before buying homes and researching industrial facilities near their neighborhoods. Margaret Kowalski, who was 8 years old when her family left Times Beach, describes the lasting impact of losing not just her home but her sense of environmental security. She moved 17 times as an adult, never staying in one place long enough to develop the community connections that her parents had enjoyed in Times Beach. Her children grew up without the extended network of neighbors and family friends that had defined her early childhood, missing out on the social stability that made Times Beach special despite its eventual contamination. Times Beach influenced current environmental regulations in ways that both strengthen and complicate pollution control efforts. Enhanced waste tracking requirements and stricter disposal standards prevent the kind of systematic contamination that Russell Bliss spread across Missouri. But the high cleanup costs associated with Times Beach also create political resistance to aggressive environmental enforcement. Corporate executives and government officials cite the Times Beach precedent when arguing against strict contamination standards, claiming that excessive cleanup requirements could bankrupt responsible companies and burden taxpayers with unrealistic remediation costs. Former Times Beach residents themselves remain deeply divided about whether evacuation was the right choice, with opinions often correlating to their age when displacement occurred and their subsequent life experiences. Elderly residents who had invested decades building their homes and community express anger about being forced to abandon everything for what they believe was an exaggerated health threat. Younger residents and parents of small children generally support the evacuation decision, arguing that no amount of money could compensate for exposing families to potentially deadly chemicals. The broader implications for environmental justice reveal how Times Beach established troubling precedents for valuing certain communities over others when contamination threatens public health. Times Beach residents were working-class families with limited political influence, making their displacement easier to justify than evacuating wealthier communities with better legal representation and political connections. Environmental justice advocates point to Times Beach as evidence that government agencies will spend enormous sums to relocate communities when political pressure demands action, but provide minimal assistance to contaminated communities that lack media attention or advocacy support. The question of what society owes communities when their homes become uninhabitable extends beyond environmental contamination to climate change impacts, natural disasters, and economic collapse that force residents to abandon places they love. Times Beach provides a template for managed retreat from uninhabitable areas, but it also demonstrates how displacement can destroy community bonds and cultural connections that took generations to develop. This tension between protecting people and preserving communities reveals deeper truths about what we value when forced to choose between safety and belonging. Times Beach reveals a truth that extends far beyond environmental disaster. This story exposes what happens when the places that define us become the places that destroy us. The community that survived the Great Depression and multiple floods couldn't survive the betrayal of the very ground beneath their feet. Right now in 2025, over 1,300 Superfund sites exist nationwide, many near residential areas, per EPA's Superfund list. Most will never receive the attention or resources that Times Beach did because they lack political influence or media coverage. Search EPA's Superfund site profile for your county to understand what contamination exists near your home. Preventing this cost billions more than the cleanup. The best way to honor Times Beach is stop pollution before it starts.